Hey, hi there. Welcome to iCoding Club. Today we are going to build a JavaScript promise from the scratch. It will be your own version of JavaScript promise. And in the process, we will not going to use any boilerplate code or any library or any framework. Now you may ask why we want to build a JavaScript promise from the scratch since we have the native version available. Well, there are a couple of reasons why you want to do that. First, you want to understand the async nature of JavaScript. You want to master that, how the whole callback system work and how JavaScript handle it. Second, you want to understand the promise itself, like what are the methods we have in it, how it work in different situations. Third, how the task and micro task work and how JavaScript event loop handle those differently. And last but not the least, you want to learn it for the interview purpose because this is one of the favorite question to be asked in advanced JavaScript interview process. Now we will do the whole coding part into step-by-step manner. We will do into two parts of this video. In the very first part, we will do start with a simple promise where we're going to see how the simple call, like then call, catch call work. In the second part, we will go a little bit, we will handle a little bit of more complicated part, and there we will do the promise chaining, and we will see how its whole thing work, and how we can implement it. In the third part, we will add a little bit more complexity, and in this case, we will see how the sub promise chaining work. What if you return a promise from one of the then method? Then how the whole system work differently? Once we're done with the simple version of promise, in the second part of the video, we will go toward creating a utility functions for the promise, like promise resolve, promise reject, promise all, and promise sum. So let's start the coding part, and I would really like if you like the content of this video, please do a like on this video, subscribe the channel, and provide your comment on the comment section of the video. Let's do the coding. Guys, let's start putting the code together. We'll start with absolute zero. This is just a open editor. I open the VS Code, and now we're going to put two files here. The first file will be the file in which we're going to have our promise code. So let's create that. We will call it my promise and .js, and the second file will be the file in which we're going to do all the testing. Now before we come to that and start putting the code in this file, let's start putting some code here, and let's put the native promise first, and that is my promise, new promise. And the way the syntax work is that the new promise, the promise constructor take a callback with two methods get passed to it. First one is resolve, and second one is reject. And the way promise work is it can result into a fulfilled state, or it can result into a failure state, right? In case we want to result into a success case, in that case all we have to do is you have to do a resolve, and whatever value you pass in this, it will get passed to the handler. So let's call it like a simple promise, right? And then we want to call it after maybe after a second. So let's put it here, and let's put a time delay of 1 second. And the way handler work here is that you put a series of then here. So we will just, for now, we will just put one. So promise dot then, and whatever value you pass here, that will get passed to this particular then callback. And if I just want to print it out, I can just do a console.log and just do a val, right? And right? And if I just want to run it, I can just do a do.test no.test.js, and definitely it will print the simple promise, so nothing special so far. What we're going to do now is we're going to replace this promise with our promise. So that is my promise, and we're going to import it from our my promise file equal to require, and here I'm using the common JS syntax, but you can use whatever you like. You can actually go for a ES6 syntax where import and exports are preferred, so that will also do. Now at this point, if I just run it, definitely we're going to get the error because we don't have anything put together in this particular file. So let's work on that. The first thing what we want here in this particular file is the constructor function. So my promise, and this is where we're going to put all our code, and just let's export it. Exports equal to my promise, and that put the basic structure. Now let's start working on the actual code. Now before we jump to that, let's put some state, and this is the state where a promise can go. So as per the ECMA group and ECMA 262 spec, a promise can be in the 3 state. So let's put those. The first state where it can be, and that is the default state, that is pending, and we can just have it pending, right? We don't need quotes. The second state where it can be, that is fulfilled, right? So we'll just write that, right? And the third state where it can go is pending. So let's put that also here. And with that, we have our main states put together, which we're going to use in our code. So if you remember in our test, a promise constructor actually take a callback, right? So let's put that callback here. And this callback required 2 functions to be passed, that is resolve and second is reject. So let's create those functions as well. Resolve, and second is reject. So slowly we are building up our structure of the whole code. And the way it works is basically where soon you call the promise, the callback get called, and in that these 2 functions get passed. Alright, so these functions actually come here, that is resolve and reject, which you can call it. So once you call it, your control will come here in this particular method, right? And when we call a resolve, it's basically result into call of success or fulfilled callbacks, right? But right now we don't have any callback, right? So let's go and try to add those, right? And the way we do it is the first method which get exposed to this promise constructor is a then function, right? So we will do same here. Let's implement a then. Then is give a callback, and what we want to do here is this particular then get called multiple time, right? I can actually have a series of then like this, and all will get the same value. So these then callbacks we need to store somewhere in our code, and the one way we can do is to putting in an array, right? So I just put one state variable here, and I just going to call it then callbacks, and I'm going to initialize it with an empty array, and I can just do a then dot push and put this particular callback, right? So we are starting with the first very simple use case where this particular then get called by the promise object directly, right? Let's do a simple check of making sure that the callback is a function. So we will come here and just write some utils, and the first one what we want here is function, and that will going to check it that is the callback is really a function or not, right? And the way we can do it, we can just check like type of operator, type of function is actually a function, right? And then we can just have a check here, and if the past callback is actually really a function, we have to check that part. If the past callback is really a function, then push it into the callback, and this callback will be get called as soon as resolve get the value. So let's do that and do a let's very simple check, like if our code is working fine. It is definitely not the perfect code, but it will just do a simple testing. So what we want is basically on our callback we just want to run a loop, and we have our callback, and we want to call this particular callback with the value passed. Alright, so let's do a simple testing, that is our code is working or not. And as expected, the whole code is actually working. Let's move further and try to implement the reject part, but before that let's try to fix one typo we have it here. The states should be pending, fulfilled, and failure. Now what we want to do in our code, in our test code, let's in place of resolve go for a reject, and that will result into an error state, right? Oops. Let's put some message. Oops. Error in simple promise. All right, and if you want to catch this one, just like then I can actually have the catch block, right? And in that case this error will come and print it here. But the way the promise work is, if the failure happened in the promise, then the successful callbacks or the fulfilled callbacks doesn't get called. It just short circuit directly to the catch block. So let's try to implement that part in our code. So basically what we want to do is, in case if it is a success case, I just want to call our then callbacks, otherwise I want to call my reject callback, right? So let's first create that method, catch callbacks, and just like then I can actually have a catch part, right? So this will just go as it is, but in place of putting in then callbacks, I can put it into the catch callback. And what I can do in place of repeating the logic into resolve and reject, I can have a dedicated method which say execute callbacks, and what this guy will do is depending on which state we are at, we are in the resolved state, or we are in the fulfilled state, or we are in the rejected state, it will either call the then callbacks or catch callback, right? So we know that as soon we come to the resolve, our state will become fulfilled, right? So let's start holding the state of promise as well. So let's start with the first state equal to state dot pending. So that will be our original state, and this need to be a let and not const because we're going to change it. And in the resolve, what I can do is I can have state as fulfilled, and same in the reject I can have as state dot failure. Alright, and then I want to call this guy, but in place of that, let's just call the execute callback, and let's put it here as well. And this I can put it here. And the logic I want to put it, if my state is in the fulfilled, then I just want to call my then callbacks. Otherwise, I want to call my catch callbacks, right? Right, so we can put it in this way. And what it will do is, like, as soon actually this to be much more cleaner, this need to be like this. State failure, and I just want to call back, right? So in this case we have dedicated block for each method. Alright, so in this case, as soon as a failure happened, this will be skipped, and we will just end up having all the calls in the failure section. So let's see, like, if our code is working. Seems like we have one small error, call back, and yeah, I forgot to pass the val, so let's do that. Val nice. So we can see that all those then are excluded, skipped from the list, and just we end up in the error callback. So far so good, it's working fine, but now we have to do one technical thing as per the Promise Spec. The way it works is that if you see right now, when we end up in success case, or in the resolve state or reject state, we are calling this function, we are iterating and just calling this function. So all these calling is happening synchronously. Now the Promise Spec says, like, promise doesn't work in this way. So the promise actually work is the way it actually work is that this particular callback is actually going to event loop. An event loop, it doesn't go into the task queue, is actually go to the micro task queue. Now if you're not sure about what is the micro task and the task, so I have a video for that, and I will put the link in the description as well, as you will see on the screen. But for now, let's assume that we understand that the micro task part, and the way you put one code into a micro task is you call a queue micro task, and the way queue micro task work is just take a callback, and whatever you pass in this, that will put into the micro task queue, and it will pull from the micro task queue from the event loop, actually pull it from the micro task queue. the one point here is that it will be called before any task in the normal task queue. So micro tasks always get priority over the normal task, right? So let's do the same thing for these guys as well, but I just don't want to repeat the whole logic together, so let's do a cleanup. So we're going to call it callbacks, and what I want is if we are in fulfill state, then the callbacks would be then callbacks, otherwise it will be a catch callbacks, right? And in that case I can just iterate over the callbacks array we just created, and that will do the other job. Let's see, like, the whole code is working. So right now we are in the reject state, so let's see, reject is working fine. And if I just go back to resolve and run it again, all good, right? Looks like both our error and the success callbacks are working fine. Now before we move forward, let's change code a little bit to align more with the Promise spec. And the spec says that a then can take then callback, but it can also take and catch callback, right? So let's call this guy as then callback and catch callback. So in place of having both a then and catch separately, you can actually just have a single then method. You can handle both the things together. And this will require a little bit of code change, so we're just going to put a word first. If then callback is there, then and it is a function, in that case in the then callbacks array just add it. Same we want to do it with the catch callback as well. So let's take a callback, check if it is a function, and if it is a function, then add it into the catch callbacks, right? And now if you see this code, right, this part is actually just a repeat of this particular function, right? So what we'll do, just to avoid the duplicacy, we can do one thing, that just call the then from here, and the first argument we can pass it as null, but the second argument could be this particular callback, which eventually call this particular block and add the catch callback as well. But let's check that if it is still working. So for that we already have the code put together. Now what I can do, I can take the callback and just put it as a second argument, and in this case I want to print via then, right? And right, so we are in the reject state, so it will actually going to print this as well as this, right? So let's put something here as well, direct. So we have both via oops and direct one print together, right? So this is good. Let's just put the code into original format. So we have done with a simple promise creation. So it is work for a then, and it work for a simple catch. Now we will go toward the more complex part step by step. Now the second one is the chaining. So let's cover that in the next part. The simple promise part. Now we can go toward the more complex, that is the first one is chaining, right? So let's copy this whole part and put it into simple promise chain testing, and we can have our code as it is for majority of part, and then we can just do a chaining. So the how it work is basically you can actually call this promise separately, all this then callback, but you can also do a chaining like this. and with then you can actually do a chaining of catch as well. Let's format it. Now, a couple of things we have to understand here first. Number one, the way chaining work is whatever argument, whatever value you will return from this particular then will actually go to this particular then, and so on, right? The value of this then will come to this then. So let's try to see, like, if we can implement that part quickly here. So we will just do a console log as it is, right? But this time we will just print something to separate it out, or just we can quit it here. We can return this value from here, right? And let's call it chain promise, and I can put it as I can put it here as t1, which will say for then 1, and then this value will get passed to this particular chain, and I can have t2, right? T2 is just then 2, and we can have this all printed here, and then we can just return this value from here. Now I think 2 is sufficient, so I just remove 1 then. Alright, so in case we have a simple native promise, the way going to print is, I guess that's fine, right? So it will just print that t1 chain promise and t2 chain promise, right? How we can modify our existing code to support this kind of chaining. Now, having a chaining in promise like this is by far the most complicated part, and that takes some time to understand, right? So I want you guys to pay attention while I modify the code, and while I do that, please note we have to support both the chaining as well as simple then called together. For that, our code will need a little bit serious modification here. So one thing we know that this then will return a promise. So let's do that. Create one new promise, and this will be my promise, the custom one what we're creating, and it will take a callback, and again it will take a resolve and a reject method. But this is basically the next set of promise, so I will call it like next resolve and next reject. And we will push the callback, or this particular callback, as we were doing previously, but with a twist. What we want to do basically is to create a wrapper, because this particular promise will get executed only when this resolved, this particular function is resolved, or this particular promise is resolved. So we have to take care of that. So in place of pushing the callback directly, let's create a wrapper and pass it like result, and in this particular callback we're going to do a next resolve, and in that I will call the callback, then callback with this result. Now how I'm getting this particular result? This particular result is actually when I call this whole or execute the whole callback, right? We have it here, right, where we're calling the whole callback, and we are passing the value inside of it, which which get passed to this particular function, and that's how this particular result is coming here, and then it get passed to the child callback, right? I hope this one is clear. Now, having in this way solve both the problem. One, to call a then directly, it need to be part of this particular callback array. right? And we are doing that when this particular method get called. Finally, this then callback get called with the particular result data. And the second use case is, if we come back to the test file, this particular one, the chaining one. So when you call the first then, whatever value you return, that need to pass to the next then. And if you see this code, this is what happening. When the callback of then get called, whatever it return, that get passed to the next result. And by doing so, we are actually passing it back to the next then, which is the then of this particular promise. Right? So I hope this whole logic makes sense. So I just kind of clean up this code. There's one more check what we have to do here, which just to make things a little bit simpler. If we will check for this callback is a function or not, and if it is not a function, then we don't have to call it back. We can just resolve it directly. So let's do that. We can use our utility. If the callback is a function, yes, go ahead and call the callback. Otherwise, just resolve. Resolve it with the result what we get. Now let's repeat the whole thing for the error block as well. So let's copy the whole code. Then and here we will do a catch, and just like this we can just call the catch callback. Just have the exactly same line, but in place of calling then callback, I'm going to call the catch callback, right? And in place of resolving, I'm going to do a reject. All good. Let's clean it up, clear the console. Let's go to the test file, and in this particular file we first want to do the testing of chaining. So let's comment this whole code for now and come back here. Now we just see what it's going to print. So it first going to print the t1 with the value, right? So I just put it chain t1 just to be clear that it's a then of chain, and then it passed the value, right? And then this value I will modify it and say that via t1, right? So we just know that this values get passed from here, and then it finally reached to this particular line, right? And in this case what it will print at t2 via t1 and so on, and then this particular value get passed to the child. Let's see if it is working. So you can see that it's printing chain t1 which is expected, and the chain promise which is get passed from this resolve, and then when we do a t2 is print the value which got passed by the first then. So that's the main difference here, right? Let's see that the normal then is also working. Right, so okay, so this one is still on reject, so let's change that part. And let's do one more thing, right? Let's resolve this particular promise in 500 millisecond, and let's this one in the 1 second. Clear it up. So we can see that it's clearly working. Simple promise, and this whole thing goes into chain, right? And now let's test the reject part. Just prefix with chain so that we know it's via the chain, and I guess we are good here. So let's try and check it. So I still have resolve, so let's comment that part. Alright, perfect, right? So it's print the first one, that is from here, and then it's print the chain one. So we can see that the whole part, the whole chaining part is also now working fine, right? And we didn't change much of code, right? Next section, let's move to the another complicated part of the promise, that is what if then return a promise in place of a simple value. So let's check that in the next section. Now we reach to the third part of the promise, where we will do a chaining of promise, but not like a simple value, but with the sub promises. And the way we can see that one is, let's take the copy of this whole section, right, and just comment it out this section, comment it out this section, and let's keep the whole code ready for sub promise chain. So we can test it like, let's have 3 then here. What we're going to do, we will keep this then as simple, right? So simple, and we will see with a value, and we'll just return it for now, that's okay. And in this particular then, in place of returning the simple value, what I want is basically return a promise. The promise what we have just created. Yeah, expected callbacks, resolve and reject. So let's first do the resolve case, and we will do it here, and we will say from P1, that stands for promise, right? I think this should be good enough, right? And then I can have this one as this is T2 and this is T3, and then we will just going to print the value here. Now the way it works is, the promise, as things work, it will first come from the micro task queue. It will print this one, the simple value. Then it will pick this one as a micro task, and as soon as see that it's not returning a simple value, it's returning a promise, it will hold the execution here. It will not go to the then. It will first wait for this whole promise to resolve, and only when this particular promise get resolved, this particular then get called, right? So this is how this whole thing works. Now we have to think like how we can implement the same thing in our code. So let's jump to here. So the one thing we know is that then is going to return a promise. So the type of that value will be a promise, right? So that basically the return of this particular call will be a promise. Now if you follow the whole code, ultimately if you do our next result, then the value of this particular callback will come here to this particular section, right? It will come to resolve, and from the resolve it will come to the execute callback via this value passing. Now what we want to do here is basically wait for rest of the then, and wait for the promise to resolve, and only then continue the execution of then calls. And we can do it in a very simple way, is first if check if the value is a promise. The value is a promise. And how we can do that? The one way to do that is, we know that if it is a promise, then it will have a function called then. So that we can check here is function, and say val.then. If that function is there, or if then is a function, then it is a promise. Now there are a couple of other ways to do that as well. You can actually check if it is the instance of my promise also or not. Now that seems logical, but the one benefit we have with this particular code is that it is much more scalable. In that case, in case you don't, you try to have the mix of multiple type of promises, the native promises, my promise, and let's say third-party promise as well. All will work here, because ultimately we are checking that the interface has then or not, right? In that sense, this whole code is pretty but much more scalable than just comparing that it is the my promise instance or not. So let's stick with that. Now what we want to do here is, a value could also be null, so let's do a check of that as well here. Now we know that it is a promise, and what we want to do is only when this particular promise is resolved, then I want to continue with my execution cycle. Right. So one way to do that is you have this val dot then callback, that is promise then callback, and then just pass the resolve. Pass our own resolve and reject. That is this particular function and this particular function. What it will do is you will reach to this particular line only when the value or this particular promise is resolved, and only when that, what we are trying to do is we are just linking on the callback. So on that resolved promise, one more then chaining is to continue with our execution. That is where we kind of stop the whole execution in between, right? So that we just want to continue from here, and once that's done, there's no point of going forward, so I will just kind of return it, because this will make sure that we resume our execution cycle after the promise, the sub promise or the child promise is resolved, right? So this is all good. Our test case is all good and ready. Let's see if our code work as expected. So we get simple chain promise, chain T2, but we didn't get the value. Okay, so let's try to resolve it in a set timeout, and this time let's put it 2 seconds and then just call it, right? So we were waiting for now for this whole resolve to execute. Let's see if it works now. It's waiting and seems like it's working. So we got simple chain promise. I guess we forgot to put it here, but that's okay. We got the idea. So it got the promise, then it print this chain T2, then it waited for this particular promise to resolve, and only when it got resolved in this particular, then it print T3, and the value what you pass from this particular child promise resolve method, right? So this is how the whole chaining works, right? So it's covered the most of this the simple cases of promise, right? The one last thing pending for this particular promise is to implement the finally. So let's implement that in the next section. Since we have done with the sub promise chaining, let's implement one last part, that is implementing a finally. And before jump to the test cases part, there is one more thing which we have to implement, and the reason for that is that these callbacks, right, any of these callback can return or throw an error anytime. So what we have to do is, while we call this these callback, we have to make sure that we have it it all wrapped under the try and catch. So what we can do here is this whole try and catch whole execution part, we can wrap it under the catch block. Let's put it here, and as soon as we end up in the catch block, what we can do is we can just go to the reject part, right? So basically we can do a reject and do a val. it will make sure that the status is changed to the failure, and the execution callback, basically the error callbacks, continue executing. Now let's jump to the promise. Let's jump to the finally part, that how to implement it. And for that, it's important to understand first that how this whole finally thing is actually work. So let's close this part. And now we will jump to the finally section, and let's name it promise. T1. We don't need the value part. We can actually execute it, skip it. Or let's have it. And here return val. Actually, the previous one was better. Let's go back to that one. T1 val, T2 val, and 3 val, right? And we have a catch block. Now the way finally work is like you can put it anywhere. Now traditionally you put it finally at the end, but this is one use case. So let's do a console log, and we say finally, but this finally can also be before, or it could be in the chaining cycle. So let's put F1, and then we have catch, and then we have finally. So the way it's supposed to work is, it doesn't matter you are executing the normal then, or you are executing the catch block. You have to honor the sequence of finally. So this particular finally must get called first, and then this particular finally. And to prove my point, let's go back to the native promise. And in this case, since we are in resolve, so it came with T1, T2, and then finally 1, then T3, and then finally it went to the final. In case of resolve, if I am in the reject, and this one is important, it still print the finally, and it still print the finally, but it honor the sequencing, and that's add a little bit of complexity in our code, and that's I just want to highlight in starting. So let's try to implement this and see, like, if we can have this code. So to do that, first of all, let's expose finally as one of the member variable, right? So I put a callback here, and the way I want to do is basically I want to add this particular callback into the then callbacks as well as in the error callbacks, because I want both to execute it. So I would just kind of put then, and then have the callback. But the way I want to do is basically the value or the result we want, we get it here. I just want to continue in the then cycle. So let's have a result, and let's pass this one to the then chaining. So it will make sure that the whole then chaining is fine, right? You come to the you put finally in between, but doesn't interfere the value of then. It is keep going to the next then method after the finally, and this code will make sure that happen. But in between, what I want to do is I also want to call back or run the callback, which is basically the finally. And by this, it will make sure that the then sequencing is working fine. But I also want to do the same thing with the error. So what I can do, I can have the same wrapper function and put it the second argument, which will make sure that this get added into the error callbacks, right? And I just want to have the same continuation of the error, right? So I can just make it very explicit here that it is error, and in that case it will just continue in the cycle, right? So let's first verify that my success case is working fine. I guess I get an error. It says cannot reproduce undefined then on the line number 90. Okay, line number 90 here. It's wrong here. Okay, one thing what we are doing wrong is we are returning the promise from the then, but when we call this then from the catch, we are not returning that value, and that's why the chaining doesn't know that it is a promise. So let's do that. All right, nice. So we got a T1 promise, T2 F1, and then finally promise, which is matching the native promise. And while we are here, let's just finish up the reject part. Nice. So we got a F1, then we got the error, and then the continuation of final block continue, and in this way we have finished up the whole chaining part of it, right? So this is what I wanted to cover in the main promise section.